this country has a very long history of impunity, of allowing its leaders to do horrible things for political and economic advantage, and then walk away. Not just walk away. In fact, I will apologize for phrasing it that way. There's a better way to phrase it. Turn around and come right back into power. And so instead of saying, look, you did a horrible job. And in some cases, that wasn't just an accident, that was deliberate. And yet we're going to give you power again, or we're going to let you remain in power. And that is in the history, it's hardwired into the country in so many ways. And yet we are at a point where if we were to pause now and seriously think about accountability, I believe it is possible to break the chain, to actually kind of enter into a new period where political and economic elites know that if they harm the great mass of American people in incredibly profound ways, that they will be held to account. And that makes a change that isn't just about those who are in power right now. It makes a change for leaders in the future. And so that's why I wrote the book. I think we're at a very critical moment. And if we don't have accountability for coronavirus criminals and pandemic profiteers, we face a very real prospect that we'll be right in this place again 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
In the next pandemic, too. I mean, that is something that we need to reckon with, because due to precipitous climate change and caused by human beings, and the fact that we are not in any way meaningfully curbing our emissions or tackling climate change in a bold way, it appears that another pandemic is inevitable some decades or even a few years down the line. We don't know. So talk a little bit about how accountability is so necessary for whenever that next pandemic does happen.
Well, first off, the best way to get to accountability is to be clear that wrong was done, to kind of break the cycle of saying that economic meltdowns and public health disasters and these things are just accidents, that they just sort of happen naturally. They don't. Now, it's true that, the stock market may crash or a health scare may sweep through the country, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible to go back in a forensic, serious way and look at people who made that circumstance possible or who made it worse. And in this case, what I'm particularly interested in, those who made it worse. This was a global pandemic. And so it hit countries all over the world. And what we want to think about then is, did the United States do as good a job as other countries? And the answer is absolutely not. When this pandemic hit it at its most extreme in late February into March of 2020, and then on through that year, the Trump administration knew that there was a risk of massive deaths. They had internal reports that talked about as many as 500,000 people dying. They knew about what should be done. They knew who they needed to cooperate with, the World Health Organization and other groups. Instead of doing that, they began to attack international health groups like the WHO. And the president himself deliberately lied to the American people, which he acknowledged to Bob Woodward during this period of time.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it is jaw-dropping.
It seems to be down the memory hole, that Bob Woodward interview where let's refresh everybody's memory, if you don't mind doing so, John, what he said and what he admitted to, basically, knowingly downplaying the risks when he knew COVID was deadly.
Absolutely. Now, remember, the key on this is to recognize that Peter Navarro, who we hear a lot about, did an internal report in the White House where he talked about the incredible threat, not just the human toll, but the economic toll. And that clearly shook some people in the Trump White House. But instead of responding by saying, wow, we got to meet this threat, we've got to do the things that are necessary, Donald Trump determined that he was going to downplay the pandemic, lie about it, undermine those who were trying to deal with it, and ultimately try to reopen the economy at a time when we weren't ready to do so. All of this was about politics. Donald Trump knew he was running for re-election. He was obsessed with using his position of power to get himself reelected. And everything that's happened on January 6th and beyond shows us just how obsessed. But a big part of this obsession was lying about the pandemic, downplaying it. And incredibly enough, the narcissist that he is, during the early stages of the pandemic, he was involved in a series of interviews with Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward for a book about the Trump White House at that time. And in March of 2020, as the pandemic was hitting, Trump said, "Oh yeah, I am deliberately downplaying this because I don't want to scare people." Right? Well, no, it was a good time to scare people. There were huge dangers coming at us, and we were unprepared as a country. There were so many things that we could have done. And what the Lancet folks concluded when they did a commission on disparities in U.S. healthcare, and particularly differences between the U.S. and other countries, was that as much as 40% of the deaths in that period from when the pandemic hit to when Trump left office were unnecessary. So when we start to talk about that, 40% of deaths, you're literally talking about hundreds of thousands of people. You're talking about millions of people who almost certainly didn't have to become infected with a virus that in many cases has lingering effects. And you're talking about tens of millions of people who might have been saved from at least some aspects of the economic crisis that extended from the pandemic. So that's a lot to be held accountable for. That's just Trump. And then you start to look at the members of his cabinet, who I examined a whole bunch of them, members of Congress, governors, CEOs of pharmaceutical companies and other corporations, and billionaires. There were all of these folks who, in this moment when the rest of us were being told it was a time of shared sacrifice, it was a time of solidarity, said, "No way, this is a time for me to advance my political career or to make a whole lot of money." And when we realize that, then we realize that it is absolutely accountable or appropriate to call for an accountability moment, to look at criminal, civil, and congressional interventions that might hold people to account for what they did wrong, but also more broadly and more importantly, to look at that court of public opinion and that question of, will we allow those who did this to us to continue in positions of political and economic power? Or will we say, no more, this is inappropriate? And the last thing I'll add, Emma, is when we talk about accountability, it can take so many forms, but I can tell you one form of accountability I'd love to start with right away. And that is that we know from great research by the Institute for Policy Studies and others that billionaire wealth increased in the United States from 3 trillion to 5 trillion during the course of the pandemic, during this incredibly short period of time. I think a great start would be to tax billionaires back to where they stood on day one of the pandemic and say, this is your shared sacrifice. You didn't have to go into a hospital room and with insufficient protective gear. You didn't have to work in a nursing home. You didn't have to, drive a bus in the early stages of that pandemic. You didn't have to risk your life, but you can contribute. You can have shared sacrifice like the rest of us. And the way to do that is to be taxed back to where you were at the start of the pandemic and give that $2 trillion to the American people in ways we can fund Build Back Better, we can fund healthcare, we can do all sorts of great things.